A kiss on the hand may be quite continental, but diamonds are a girl's best friend. A kiss may be grand, but it won't pay the rental on your humble flat or help you at the automat. Men grow cold as girls grow old, and we all lose our charms in the end. But square cut or pear shape, these rocks don't lose their shape. Diamonds are a girl's best friend.
So, who has a question? Okay, let's start here.
I'm interested to know if the stones that are on display in the gallery are cubic zirconia, and where did you get them, and how is it that you were able to get ones that were cut so perfectly historically?
Well, all of the stones on exhibit are the product of Scott Sucher from New Mexico. He's a world-renowned stone cutter and gemologist, and he does use cubic zirconium as his medium. There's an interesting new one that's even harder, but he's investigating that. But the details of that process and all are displayed in the Smith Gallery.
Yes, the exhibit on display right now is a very interesting collaboration between two artists. It's Mr. Stuart himself, who created the figures, and then Mr. Sucher, who you just mentioned. He is living near Albuquerque in New Mexico, and he has been replicating historic diamonds for a long, long time. And so we brought these two men together to put this exhibit together. And in addition, because Mr. Sucher normally produces diamonds at full scale, so the diamonds you see in there, this is how they look in real life. But we also convinced him to reproduce those exact diamonds at a quarter scale, so that then Mr. Stuart was able to set them on his figures. And so that's just a nice little side effect of this collaboration, because these diamonds are here to remain with us and with the figures. There's another question here.
Supposedly when George III was crowned, the major jewel fell out of the crown. You've heard that story? That symbolized also.
Tell us the story, sir. Tell us the story, briefly.
Well, the Vice President, when he's being crowned, his coronation in 1760, supposedly one of the major jewels fell out, and that was considered to be a bad omen. Of course, we all know what happened many years later. Have you heard that story?
I've heard something like it, but not that particular one. Is that the story now?
Yeah.
Nobody kicked it under the sofa and they never saw it again?
You did mention the major, I think it's called the Star of Africa, and the scepter that's in the royal collection. Is that possibly the same stone? There was no mention of the Star of Africa.
I don't think so. I think that the stone that you're referring to is much larger than the stones in his crown would have been. That's my opinion.
So is there any story on that major stone?
Of the stone falling out business?
Well, no, just the scepter itself as a major.
Oh, I don't know of it. As soon as you find out, you share it with us. Thank you. Appreciate that. We can always use another good story, especially if there are loose ladies in it. Not loose stones.
So you are still manufacturing the figures?
Well, when I can get out of my iron lung and crawl over into my wheelchair to the workbench and my blind eyes can focus and one damn thing or another. Not much, no. I think we've done enough damage.
I can actually insert a little pop quiz here. So, in the exhibit, there's one figure that was specifically made for this exhibit. So, it had its debut when we opened the exhibit in May. Does anybody know which which figure that is?
Well, they haven't seen the exhibit.
The Shah, yes, front row in the middle.
Gets the gold star.
Collect your cookie after.
Actually, what she had in mind was a diamond. All right, anybody else? I think we should proceed with our fount of misinformation, and thank you for your comments and questions and your attendance. Well, the next diamond is one of the most famous of all, the Regent diamond, again mined in the Golconda mines. This is a more contemporary view of the mining operation today. Golconda's gone out, I think, I don't know how much actual mining is done there in this last 50 years, probably some. The Regent diamond, as it was eventually called, was discovered at and weighed in at about 410 carats, uncut. Some thought it was the biggest stone ever found at that time. Now, there have been other larger stones since, but this was a really colossal one. This is the early 18th century we're talking about. Well, it was in 1700, it was acquired by this gentleman, Thomas Pitt. He was the governor of Madras for the British, and he acquired it from a local merchant, we think. It's not too clear. He did acquire it, and usually it's from a merchant. He sent it to England to be cut, and it was cut down to 140 carats. Well, you know, they would cut a stone like you just saw in the rough, maybe once, and that would make halves or 2/3 and 1/3 and so on. So it wasn't just cut to rubble. All the cuttings are made into precious gems. So anyway, a man named Joseph Cope did the cutting, and it took him 2 years to do it. Now, we have this, what you are looking at are lead castings from a cast of the original stone when it was originally cut in 701 or 2. And these lead castings have lasted. So we know what the stone looked like when it was first cut. The original stone, of course, we don't have a photograph of it because it was then cut again. Well, Mr. Pitt went to England, and oh goodness, he had a trail of bad rumors surrounding him virtually the rest of his life about how he had betrayed and murdered somebody to get the stone. Oh, I don't know, it went on and on and on. His acquisition of the stone was thought to have been by foul means. There's always somebody, probably competitors in the merchant trade, but he never spent 2 nights in the same place. And he went around partly in a beard and a disguise. He was afraid people were going to kill him and steal his stone. It was a miserable life having something that valuable, because when the rumor is that he's got a diamond the size of your head, you know, it's very difficult. Well, that's where you go. Eventually, the stone was sold. And he tried to sell it to Louis XIV, but Louis was diamond up to the gills. It was a terrible time. Between 1700 and 1713, France was totally bankrupt from the wars. Absolute catastrophe of economic collapse. So that wasn't the best time to buy a diamond. But in 1717, a few years later, the Duc d'Orléans had become the regent of France for the then baby Louis XV. And they were still bankrupt, but not quite so bankrupt. And the regent and his advisors were given, had to inspect the stone because the seller wanted everybody to see what a great thing it was, and he pumped it up to be a national treasure if they just were bright enough to take it. And finally, they were talked into it. It was to be a national treasure. It was so beautiful and so big and so heavy. Well, now it was called the Regent diamond. This is the way it was cut, pillow cut. Absolutely stunning diamond. It wasn't blue, or this appears a little, it was clear. And Louis XV, not wearing his crown, wore it in his crown on his coronation. And his wife, Queen Maria Leginsky, wore it frequently in jewelry she had built for it, on and off. It was worn by Louis XVI in his crown. You can see the crown under his right hand there, but I don't think the stone is evident. And it wasn't in a scepter. And it was also worn by his Queen Marie Antoinette. Now, she preferred very delicate jewelry, so when she had a choice of diamonds that had come down, they weren't the royal jewels, she had no access to them, but she would have many of these gems cut up to smaller sizes and mounted in more delicate settings. But she wore the Regent in her hair. We have a portrait of her wearing it in a rather, well, a mounting like you can see there. And she wore it as a necklace from time to time. But it was spared her jeweler's chopping block, as it were. But they weren't. In 1792, the revolution overwhelmed France. The royals were imprisoned and then executed. And in the middle of the chaos, here, that's the Garde Meuble, that great big building. It had just been finished at the time, just before the revolution. And of course, in all the hubbub going on, thieves broke into the back of the building, found their way to the jewel collections, scarfed up everything they could, and made off. And for many years, stones from that theft were not recovered, including the Regent. But years later, when they were rebuilding a lot of Paris, which is what happens, carpenters working on a roof beam in one of the buildings found the beam to be hollowed out in one side where you couldn't see it, and in the back of it was a leather pouch, and in the leather pouch was a velvet pocket, and in the pocket was the Regent. Well, the Directory of France, here they are hammering away at the roof beams or something. The Regents, the Directory of France were bankrupt, so they were selling all the royal products that they could scrape together. There was a huge amount of royal furniture and gems and all kinds of things. And they were selling them to make money for the national treasury of the revolutionary government. And they directed that the Regent be pawned to pay for Napoleon's Egyptian campaign. And it was pawned. It was recovered because the finances made it possible to recover it, but they used it for that purpose. So Napoleon went out and had a disastrous campaign, came home an absolute hero to the French, and from there he hopped into the imperial seat as Emperor Napoleon I, and he put the Regent diamond in the hilt of his coronation sword. Now, there's a cup at the base of the grip. It's not the knuckle bow, but the sort of a cup-like saucer. And the Regent is mounted in that. If you look carefully, you'll see it. It's a mound of diamond. Just a gorgeous thing. That still exists. This may be a replica because the actual stone is elsewhere. At any rate, when Napoleon was swept from power, he was, in the last hours of his existence in Paris, was trying to organize his wife, his second wife, Maria Louisa, who was sort of bovine and awfully hard to organize. She had their son, and he saw to it that his aides brought her all the gems that could be found that belonged in the royal collection, and gave her the box, or whatever they were, containers to take custody of, because the Allies, the British and the Austrians and the Prussians, were not about to do anything nasty to her. And she eventually fled to Austria, her homeland, and threw herself on the mercy of her father. Well, carrying the stones with her. Francis I, her father, wanted to reestablish himself with the French. Now the Bourbons were reestablished themselves. So he sent all of the so-called borrowed treasures including the Regent, back to France as a good neighbor policy. And that's why France now had it again to enjoy as part of its national treasury. And it was worn by the restored Louis XVIII, the brother of the king that was beheaded, and then his brother, Charles X. They all wore these crowns when they were crowned, and they put the stone in. And then a little later on, Napoleon's nephew became Emperor Napoleon III. He wore it in his coronation crown. And his wife also wore it because she was a great beauty, Eugenie, and magnificently accoutred always, and she wore it in a diadem. So it was seeing the light of day quite frequently. Well, in the late 1880s, the National Assembly of France decided to sell all this stuff, get rid of it, add to the treasury to sell it, but too many people had a memory and they said, no, you cannot sell the Regent. It's part of the French national heritage, idiot. And of course it wasn't so. So it remains one of the treasures of the French, exhibited in the Louvre, except in 1940, when the German army occupied Paris. It's interesting how many of you saw the Monuments Man? All right. Well, a hell of a lot went on before any invasion took place, because all these governments that were under threat of invasion by the German forces were trying to hide their treasures for months ahead of time. They were scurrying everything out of the Louvre they could, out of Versailles, out of Saint-Cloud, out of all the royal residences, putting them away in hidden places. And the Regent was taken off to the Chateau Chambord, which was the house of Charles X's son out in the Loire Valley. And as I understand it, it was hidden away in a basement, a closet. The basements of these buildings were simply enormous, little tiny, all going over. It was a place where they kept the mops and buckets. And they pried a stone loose at the base of the wall, because these are all stone buildings. And the stonemason took 20 minutes to chip out enough space in the back of the rock to put the gem in with its covering and put the rock back in place, and nobody was the wiser. Until after the war, the original hiders brought it forth again, and now it was back in the Louvre in the Salon Apollon, or the Apollon Gallery. Now this, I remember this runs perpendicular to the Seine. The window at the far end just overlooks the Seine River, and all the stones are in cabinets running down the middle of the room, as you can see, and one of them has the Regent diamond in it in glorious display. It's considered to be the most perfect diamond ever cut in modern times. So go look at it in the gallery. Do not touch. Now we come to our final saga, and this is the Taverner French Blue, or Pope. It isn't Pope, it's Hope. The Hope diamond, eventually it becomes, but it starts out as something entirely different. It was discovered in the Collioure mines, and these are more recent photographs, probably in the 20s. The mines are in and around these buildings. And its initial weight was 110 carats. Never trust me with numbers. 110 carats, and it was blue. That was its most distinctive quality, is blue, a blue diamond. There are other colors of diamonds, yellow and pink and so on, yellow. But it was probably discovered sometime in the 1630s and sold to a man named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier by a merchant. He's gone native, you can tell. He was a French fellow who was a merchant of many goods, including precious stones, in the late 17th century. And he'd traveled to India at that time. Now, it's not clear that he actually picked up the stone in India. He may have actually purchased it in Venice in 1642. There are indications that that's what happened. It doesn't matter. He took it to France in 1668 or so, and sold it to Louis XIV. He sold a lot of stones to Louis XIV. Louis was a great connoisseur of gems as well, and he had a treasury of them. And he was so impressed with the blue diamond that Tavernier had, and he purchased at a huge price, that he just loved the daylights out of Tavernier. And he was so taken with Tavernier that he gave him titles and a handsome villa and showered him with honors and so on. He's gone native again. It looks more like Madame Pompadour to me, but anyway, he was having a giddy old time on the results of his sales to Louis XIV. Well, in 1673, Louis turned the stone over to his goldsmith, Pitot, to recut, because it wasn't as brilliant as he had hoped. So Pitot cut it down, probably another 6 carats, to around 41 carats, something like that. And he lost in size, but made up in brilliance what was the goal of the cutting. Now, Louis wore this stone. Here's the way it looked after it was recut. It's an interesting shape. I don't think there's a formal name for it. It's not a heart. Anyway, Louis wore it around his neck and on a ribbon, and he wore it as a stick pin. He wore it in his hat. He wore it. He did wear it out, but he certainly had good use of it while he was alive. And then his successor, Louis XV, had it mounted by his jeweler, Jacomet, in the Order of the Golden Fleece, which had been bestowed. The Order of the Golden Fleece is an Austrian imperial order, which is bestowed on other rulers for great deeds of alliance and one thing. They'd just formed an alliance, the Austrian and the French, who would always hate each other. Now they were allied, and in honor he was given the order, and Louis XV had the order designed. You could design your own order, but he did. And this is the way the design looked. And here is Louis XV wearing the order when he was an old man. And it hangs nearly to his waist. It's simply huge. You can see this. You can't see the original order, but you can certainly see the original stone. It's the bottom one in the complex of gems. Now, Louis XVI wore it as well, the Golden Fleece, just as his grandfather had designed it. But here we go again with that damned revolution. You see, in the 1790s, with all this chaos going on, the Revolutionary Constituent Assembly removed all the gems and treasures from the royal palaces into the Garde Meuble, and what happened to them? Somebody's been listening. How could that be? Well, anyway, yes. This was shortly after the September massacres. Any of you French history? Well, you don't want to know that. They were stolen. And they didn't, the French blue did not emerge again until, I don't know, several months later in London. And it was up for sale. Many of the stones had been broken up and recut and sold again, but not the French blue. It was, however, in 1812 recut, because whoever it was that controlled it didn't like the cut that I just showed you. And it was down to, I don't know, 30-some carats. Now it may have, is the key, offered to the Prince Regent, who later became George IV, because the famous painter Lawrence painted George in his garter robes with a stone that looks very much like the French blue in his stock, in his neckcloth. But others say, no, that wasn't the Regent. The Regent was around, but we'd lost sight of it. That's the trouble. We lost sight of it until 1839, when this gentleman, Henry Philip Hope, died and his estate was sold up. And the prize of the collection was the Hope diamond. That's where it gets its name. Isn't it beautiful? Well, his nephew bought the stone from his own family's, auction, and he displayed it in the Crystal Palace. Here's the nephew, Henry Thomas Hope. And then they went to the Crystal Palace and then on to the World's Fair in Paris. They displayed it there. It was traveling around, showing it off. But finally, in the late 80s, it descended to Lord Francis Hope, who was apparently a spendthrift and a bankrupt and debt-ridden, as they say in polite society. And he tried to sell it, and of course the rest of the family said, no, you can't. They jumped all over him. He said, no, you can't sell it. It's part of our inheritance. You know, it was their inheritance too. You can't just go out and sell the damn diamond. So he didn't. But he tried again in '99. He wasn't going to give up. Well, he was still broke. And finally in 1901, he succeeded. And the Hope was sold to the Joseph Franklin Son diamond stone cutters and collectors for 33,000 pounds. It's actually $4 million. So there it went. And they sold it, finally, to a broker, Jack Collette, who committed suicide. So the stone went back to the Frankels. And a Russian prince, Kaniatowski, bought it. He was a fiery character. He shot his actress over the footlights. I guess there was some altercation. I don't think it was about the diamond, but it was a lover's tryst. And then later on, somebody stabbed him to death. Gets better by the minute. Finally, it was sold to a Turkish sultan who was killed in an accident. And the stone went back to the Frankels again. You know, it kept going home or whatever. And they finally sold it. Well, they didn't finally sell it. A man named Rousseau bought it, and then he sold it to somebody else. And that person was none other than Pierre Cartier. You ever heard of him? Famous ice skater? Oh. Well, anyway, he bought it for 400,000 francs. It was down from 1,500,000, so it was coming down in price, but at least it was moving. The Hope now had this wonderfully sinister history, which everybody loves, that sort of thing, you know, everybody being murdered and spiked and murder, mayhem and all the rest of it. Well, Cartier then sold it to, you'll never guess who. Evelyn Walsh McLean was the heiress of her father's mining billions. And it was a hard sell. She bought endless diamonds from Cartier. He was her private jeweler. And he presented this stone to her, and she wasn't taken with it for some reason. And he followed her around. She went to Paris. He took a load of stones, and this one all carefully doctored up to be special. And well, maybe someday. She just couldn't settle on it. Well, finally, in 1910, she did buy it. He had it reset, not recut, but reset. And the final price was $180,000. Practically giving it away, you see. And then people began to tell her, you know, probably her best friend, well, Evelyn, don't you know about the curse? If you wear this, everything's going to go bad for you, honey. But, you know, she said, to hell with the curse, I'm going to have a good luck from it. And she wore all her jewels all at once, usually. There's a funny story. She was having earrings fitted, and they were diamonds, of course, pendants, beautiful. And she was looking at them in the mirror, and the jeweler was saying, oh, madam, you have spectacular, blah, blah. And she said, you know, I think you need one more diamond on each side here. And the jeweler was horrified because it would just, to him, it would ruin the effect. And he immediately, he said, oh, madam, perhaps we must think of taste. She said, taste? Hell, they're my diamonds. Put the damn diamond on the earring. I like Evelyn. She knew how to deal with her diamonds. Ah, sweetie. Well, she did, now this is the way it was reset and how she purchased it and how she wore it. There she's wearing it. In a very modest parure, she's hardly wearing any jewels at all. Apparently somebody got to her and plucked everything off, half a pound of jewelry, because she really clanked. She outdid Queen Alexandra, who was a rhinoceros in diamonds. Well, anyway, now she outdid Louis XIV, who wore scads of diamonds. But in 1947, still wearing the diamond, she died. And then her estate managers and her, what do you call it, that takes care of it, executor, had to gather up all the stones. She had all these jewels, a jewelry set, and she put everything everywhere. She wrapped it up in tissue paper, put it behind the books, and she put something in the refrigerator, and she had something under her nightstand. They were just going everywhere to find things. They found the Hope wrapped in what passed for Kleenex then, stuffed behind in the radio. We all had wooden radio cabinets in the 40s. You didn't, but I did. I'm old enough to remember fancy wooden cabinets, the radio was in it. It was stuffed in there. So they found the Hope Diamond. And it was now sold again with the estate. It alone was sold for $176,000. And Harry Winston bought all of it. He bought the whole business, but it went up to $1 million, the whole business, all of her gems, to $1,250,000, which isn't extraordinary for a good collection of gems. Well, Winston had dreams of grandeur, and he presented it eventually. Well, he traveled around first. He took it all over the world, and he would use it as a fundraiser. You could look at it if you paid, naturally. And so he raised funds for good causes here and there. But finally, in a fit of public wisdom, I don't know what you'd call it, he presented it to the Smithsonian Institution. That's the building I used to work in. Well, the Hope Diamond has many attributes, but above all, it is one of the most beautiful stones ever found and cut, and it is blue. Oh, lip licking. Hope you've enjoyed the diamond show.
Come a time when a lass needs a lawyer, but diamonds are a girl's best friend. There may come a time when a hard-boiled employer thinks you're awful nice, but get that ice or else no dice. He's your guy when stocks go high, but beware when they start to descend. It's then that those louses go back to their spouses. Diamonds are a girl's best friend.